Thank you all for coming. Thank you for sharing in this experience. The Holocaust Remembrance Film Series is 5 Thursdays. The next 3 films will be available to you online to stream, and they're each as interesting and well made as this film. That we really got a great year. This year's theme is women during the Holocaust. The last film that we'll be showing will be again an in-person event back here on August 17th. White Bird, which is a sneak preview of a film that's not yet released, that has Helen Mirren and Gillian Anderson in supporting roles, and takes place in France during the occupation. I thank the Consul General of Hungary for being here. Köszönjük. I get to practice my Hungarian, which is always an extra added pleasure. I'm so happy to be joined by Eva Nathanson, who lived this experience, having survived the Holocaust and living in Hungary until the 56 revolution. And Leslie, who knows everyone in the world and who I know through many ways, but I was fortunate enough to get to meet her and her mother when their book came out, which if you haven't read, I recommend you to search it out and order it on Amazon. It's a great book. I wanted to begin by asking you, Eva, to tell us a little bit, not really about your experiences during the Holocaust, but really about after, and really sort of the theme of this film, what it was like to be there when so many others were not in Budapest.
My mother married after the war my birth father's best friend, and he raised me. He was one of the kindest and most decent human being I have ever met. He has not joined the Communistic Party when everybody was supposed to, and that had caused a lot of issues for all of us. He was a master craftsman in wood, and because the government needed his work, that was the only reason he was not deported, because he was had nothing to do with the communists. But it was always hanging over our heads. And I was the only Jewish girl in class, or most of the school. There was a couple of Jewish boys left, but nobody else was, and which had always put sort of a different angle on everything else. I remember we had to put out the flags, communistic flags, on every holiday. And somebody reported that my mother said to the flag, "You will last as long as the communism." So of course we were found, the communists came and searched the house and threw things all over the places, and they charged us a fortune. And it was like that every few months after a while. It was a very difficult time.
And Leslie, your mother, having survived, nonetheless had ongoing trauma that both you witnessed, you experienced, and as you wrote about, your daughter also had some of the after effects. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, my mother was 5 years old when my mother was born in Poland, and she was 5 years old when her 15 members of her family went into hiding in the attic of a farmer in Poland. And they thought they were going to be hiding in the attic for 2 weeks, and they wound up hiding in the attic for 2 years. And ultimately in the attic, my mother's younger brother died, and her mother died. And you know, our book kind of our book's called Bending Toward the Sun, and it chronicles my mother's journey. She came to this country when she was 12 years old, didn't speak a word of English, had never been to school because the war started when she was 5. But so she started school for the first time in 7th grade, and her first serious depression was when she was graduating from high school, and she remembers all her friends going on to college to get married, to get jobs, and she suddenly felt this extreme depression. And her father said, "You're not crazy, you don't need a psychiatrist," but she knew that she did, and she found one on her own. And she said ultimately she noticed again that trees had leaves, that flowers had colors. She said, "I felt myself bending toward the sun." And that's how we got the name of our book. But growing up, ultimately she met my father, got married when she was 19. And as I was growing up, I also had a lot of anxiety. I had a lot of guilt, first of all, that I had so many of the things my mother hadn't had, like birthdays and a mom. But I also had a lot of separation anxiety. I never wanted to sleep at anyone's house or go to camp. And but ultimately, I grew up and became a lawyer and then a television executive and got married and had my own children. And I was certain that because my husband wasn't connected with the Holocaust in any way, and you know, I was an independent, strong adult, that my children wouldn't have any of the anxiety I had had. And as we wrote our book, we learned a lot about the way trauma gets transmitted from generation to generation. And I was surprised to see my children, and particularly my daughter, having a lot of the same separation anxiety that I had had.
You know, a lot of what both of you said are the very themes of this film, which is why it's such a special film in that way. And one of the things about the film that really struck me was this bond between Klara and Aldo that, you know, for an American audience at first seems like it may verge on the inappropriate. But I know from my experience of growing up with my parents who were survivors, and by the way, just to hear a Hungarian accent, you know, warms my heart so much. That the survivors often felt that only other survivors could understand them, could feel that everyone else really couldn't understand their world or them, and so talk a little bit about that.
Well, my parents were very, very damaged.
Put the mic to your mouth.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
My parents were very damaged. My father lost 10 siblings and all his family, and my mother lost 6 siblings and most of our family, and they were not talking about it much. On the high holidays, my mother would be always a mess, and my father was always a mess because that everything came back to them. Being the only Jewish girl in school, I didn't share any of this stuff, and my parents were very worried for me to go to people's homes because they were afraid they will say something anti-Semitic or something they didn't want me to hear. And my father adopted me when I was 5 and a half, and I wasn't told that he wasn't my birth father because I was such a mess emotionally, physically, and psychologically after the war that the doctors felt that it was better for me not to have one more trauma. So my parents were also worried that somebody will tell the truth. It was, I had two very loving parents who were very, very damaged, very hurt. And I was married to a psychologist, and when I came here to the United States, I married somebody. I came here when I was 16 and got married when I was 19. We are divorced, but I had a lot of therapy on and off for the past 20 years. It is, I think I'm a pretty functioning human being, but when any kind of trauma happens, it still things comes back to me.
And Leslie, did your mother have other survivor friends? Were they important to her?
She did have other survivor friends. She, when she started school, she made a point not to talk about her Holocaust experience. Her friends that she met in New York at first, and then her family moved to Chicago, were not Holocaust survivors. She just wanted to be a, what she calls a normal American person. But ultimately, later on, she met Holocaust survivors, joined a Children of Holocaust Survivor group, got bat mitzvahed with 6 other Holocaust survivors when she was in her 40s. She's now 86. But I think it wasn't, my interpretation of the film even, which, for us does border on the inappropriate, but I think what's so relatable is everybody wants love and needs to be loved. And I think this lonely, grief-struck child felt a vacuum in this other human being who was also looking to be loved. I think they sensed that in each other. So to me, I'm not sure it was so much that they were looking for another Holocaust survivor, but they were, they needed to be needed in that way and to be held in that way. And they saw in each other, what each other needed.
I have to agree. I had not talked about the Holocaust at all for years, for anybody, unless somebody asked me. If somebody asked me, I would tell them. Matter of fact, when I first got married, a young couple lived across the hall from us, and we spent a lot of time together. None of us mentioned that we both were Holocaust survivors. And at one point, she said to me, "By the way, are you a Holocaust survivor?" And that's how we found out after being known each other for like 5 years, because we couldn't talk about it either.
Well, my experience was quite different. I grew up in a building in New York City, in an apartment building where all the other children I knew were children of Holocaust survivors. All the parents who didn't know each other beforehand were Holocaust survivors. And not having uncles and aunts directly in our family and having only one grandparent, our notion of family, who we called uncle or aunt, were often people who shared this experience, and this experience also of European background and experience and certainly culture, but also of survival. And again, I don't know if that's anything you relate to, but I kind of feel in this movie that, they are forming their own family from those who remain.
Exactly. I used to, in a school, everybody was talking about all the family that came over for dinner. And my mother always made sure that we had a Friday night dinner, and we invited all the people who didn't have family just like us. And I would say the next day at school, "Oh, I had my own uncles and aunts," and they were not.
Right.
Most of them were not, but I wanted to feel that I was accepted by the others.
Yeah, and I will say, and I'm looking at my cousin who's there, Fanny, whose grandmother hid in the attic with my mother. They were cousins, and she works at the museum now. And so she might have her own thoughts. But I know that for my mother, family was everything. And so I could imagine in the film they wanted to create their own family. And even growing up, our friends were very secondary in my mother's eyes. Like, you know, nothing was more important than our family having dinner together. And our, you know, so we were kind of almost made to feel a little bit bad about anyone taking precedence over
Yeah,
family.
I was also hidden for 2 years, and then I was tied to my mother and shot into the Danube when I was 4. So after the war, I had a lot of physical and emotional issues. So I think they were trying to protect me by even talk about all that stuff. But when I came to this country, I wanted to be an American so badly that I didn't speak any of the languages I used to speak, which was 3, because I wanted to be an American so badly. And it took me, actually, that friend who lived across the street from us, after a while, when we discovered that we both were Holocaust survivors, that after many years later, she actually introduced me to children of the Holocaust group.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I got into the museum also.
I just wanted to ask you, just because in this movie we see after 1945, after February 1945, the communists took over.
Yes.
The Russians liberated Budapest after a siege that began in October of 1944, and by February 1945 they'd taken over, and by 47 it was a communist country and you couldn't leave anymore.
Correct.
And we see in this film the officials of the communist government were not so sympathetic to Jews, and it was a whole new order to live under. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's all true.
Yeah.
We had not advertised that we were Jewish. We did, but we lived like Jewish people, but we did not advertise it.
And under the communists, there was no religion.
Well, there were synagogues,
Right.
and there were churches, and you know, people went.
Did you go to the Dohani?
No, well, afterwards, but just to visit. I lived in a suburb of Budapest, Budapest, because that's where the craftspeople lived, and that's where my father lived.
And, you know, something that you brought up, Leslie, which is really that, I mean, what's, I thought so well done in this film is that, again, even though the relationship to us verges on the inappropriate, nonetheless, it sort of brings us to a truth about how individuals can come back to life, how someone who's a walking, you know, almost a zombie, we would say now, cut off, unable to conceive of going on, does manage to not 100%, but create loving relationships and go on. And I know that in your mother's case, you know, yes, she had a family, she, you know, raised successful children, but the darkness, there were still dark days. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think, first of all, my mother never learned how to deal well with separation or endings, because even after the war, I think her family felt that the best way to deal with her mother dying and her younger brother dying was just not to talk about it. And so, you know, I think there was always just this terror involved with death. So in my growing up, I noticed that when I, in particular, was graduated from college, about to graduate from law school, when we finished writing our book, my mother went through these major depressions. And most notably when we finished writing our book, because we had spent quite a bit of time working together and almost being colleagues. And I think also my mother was about to turn 70, and she went through, again, a very serious depression. But, you know, there is something about survivors. And, you know, my mother now at 86, knock on wood, I mean, she's strong. I never thought she would survive even my father dying, because they had their own sort of twinship relationship, and my mother was my mother's very likable, and she always finds somebody to love her and take care of her and help her. So, you know, there's
She needs a project.
well, no, she needs to be taken care of, and she's really good at that. But I'm more and more marvel at the fact that there is something to being a survivor, and that strength.
I have to agree with that. Being a survivor changes a lot of things in your life as you go along with it. And I've been through a lot of issues in my life, and I always survived. And I also think it has a lot to do with the fact that I am a survivor, and that I'm not giving up that easily.
Yes, please.
The Consul General at the opening indicated that how many Jews did survive. What percentage of the population were they in 1945? And what was the population of Hungary at that time? And what was the population of in the movie afterwards? So
the question was about what percentage of the population was Jewish, and how many survived, and all that. I think at the beginning of the war, there were an estimated 800,000 Jews in Hungary, of which 600,000 were in Budapest, 200,000 were in the countryside.
Out of a population of how
I'm getting to it. Sentence goes on. Out of a population of about 3 million, so they were about a third of the population at the time, and certainly in Budapest they were maybe even a little bit more than a third, but around more.
Yeah, no, more.
More.
The population was more. It was more than 10 million altogether.
10 million?
Yeah, more than 10 million.
Oh, really?
So
then I'm mistaken.
I thought that. I think that about 5%, between 5 and 10% of the population were Jewish.
But in Budapest, it was a higher percentage.
Yeah,
and then what happened is when the Nazis did arrive, I mean, there were, to your point, sir, beginning in 1938, there were anti-Jewish legislation. Jews could no longer work in certain professions. They could no longer do certain things in Hungary, attend certain schools. They were very limited. And then Jewish men were required to serve on labor brigades. That was the next phase of it. And then, but those were not, people did die, but those were not mass deportations and killing. When the Germans came into Budapest in April 1944, March 19th.
March 19th.
Yeah, March 18th, 1944, and they were then Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, was headquartered and put in charge of Hungary. And at first, the Jews were rounded up from the countryside, and some of them were fled to Budapest, others were deported from the countryside. And then from those 800,000 people, between April, May of 1945, and October of that year, 600,000 Jews were deported on trains to death camps, primarily Auschwitz, and as the council said, were murdered. As the council said, there was a regent of Hungary named Horthy who tried to, like a politician, play every side and remain neutral. He was quickly, by July of 44, deposed. There was a Hungarian fascist leadership called the Nyilas. And the Nyilas are those who rounded up Jews and shot them in the Danube. They were Hungarians. They were Hungarian fascists. And they are certainly collaborators of the Nazis. So that is kind of the story of the Holocaust in Hungary in brief. But again, this movie, what's so striking is that it tells you about after, not about the murders, but about the survival and how difficult that was to be in a place where, first of all, you didn't even know the fate of your family members and friends and schoolmates and colleagues. Again, given that beginning in 1938, the Jews had less contact with non-Jewish people unless they had gotten false papers. It was a city of ghosts.
The movie had a reference to the Aldo saying he might be taken away. What was that?
By the communists.
Yeah.
By the Russians.
Why would they be taking him away?
Because they sent people to the Gulag.
They deported a lot of people.
You may have heard of Raoul Wallenberg. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat in Budapest who, by issuing papers that granted Swedish protection to Jewish citizens, saved a lot of lives. In January 1945, when the Russians arrived in Budapest, they requested a meeting with Wallenberg. Wallenberg was never seen again. He is now believed to have died in 47 in a prison in Moscow. Some people believe he lived longer, but that's the current thinking. So the Soviet Gulag system and people who were not loyal to the Communist Party became targets of denunciation and also disappearance. In Hungary, in Budapest, there's a museum that I have mixed feelings about, but it's called the Terror House. And it's actually the former place where the communists interrogated people. It had been a police station, then a Nazi prison, and then it became a communist prison. And I have some problems with it because it makes some equivalence between the Nazis and the communists. But for the citizens of Hungary, the feeling of persecution existed under both regimes. That certainly we can say.
Exactly. I was betrothed to somebody when I was 12 years old because my father was worried that they will be deported, and they felt that since I wasn't legally, he was adopted by him, but because I wasn't his daughter, he thought that maybe that way they could save me. I have two sisters. As a matter of fact, one of them is there, and but they were very young in Hungary, so that they grew up here.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
To maybe follow on to the last question, from what we saw in the movie and what you're telling us, being Jewish after the war was less of a problem than what the communists
Well,
might do to you.
The communists didn't openly got all the Jews together and deported them. They were, it was not a positive thing to be a Jew, but for a while it wasn't positive to be even a Catholic, because the communists were against all religion. They wanted everybody to be alive. But the fact was that they were, like I had long braids, and they sent a note to my parents when I was 14 or 13 years old, that they had to have my hair cut because I was the only Jewish girl and I was the only one with long braids. And they said that I needed to look like everybody else.
And I would just add that, as you know, the war being over didn't end anti-Semitism in any country. And my mother's family went back to their home in Poland, in the southeast of Poland, not far from Russia, in July of 1944. And a few weeks later, a friend knocked on the door and said, if your family goes to sleep tonight, no one's going to wake up in the morning. They will all be killed. And their entire family, my mother, her sister, her father, and her 4 uncles and the cousins who lived down the street, all left again, everyone who had hidden in the attic. And this time they traveled throughout Europe in displaced persons camp, wound up in Italy, and it was 5 years until they found a way to come to the United States.
And Ava was lucky is the wrong word. Like they say in the movie, lucky is not the right word, but she was fortunate to be able to escape
In 1956,
at the time of the Hungarian Revolution.
my father and my mother and my 2 little sisters, we escaped to Austria. It took us 6.5 hours to cross the border because the Russians were throwing up flares and we had to hide in the snow. And then we spent 9 months in a DP camp in Austria because my dad had registered with Hayas, and Nixon was the acting president because Eisenhower had a heart attack. And in his wisdom, he decided only 3 Jews would come to the United States to 100 Hungarians. So we were in a DP camp for 9 months in northern Austria.
Let's take 1 or 2 more questions and then, yes, ma'am.
So what was the percentage of the Jewish population that left in '56 during revolts? And also, you said that there was a 2-year window of opportunity between 45.
And 47.
Right, so what did it take to get out then, and why didn't more Jews leave then if they had the opportunity?
So I don't know the percentages of how many Jews escaped in '56. In '56, people.
180,000 people escaped.
100
I don't know.
180,000 people
I
escaped.
don't know how many of them
Yeah.
were Jews.
I don't know how many of them were Jews. The 1945 to 47. It's very hard to decide to leave your country and leave your profession and how much you can take with you and start anew. My mother and her mother, my mother and my grandmother, did decide to leave in 47. And they went to Vienna, and in Vienna they stayed a while, but didn't really want to live in Vienna because they found it not very. It was a 4-power city, and it was not very welcoming. And eventually they went to Montreal, where there was a nice Hungarian Jewish community and Hungarian Jewish restaurants where they could eat the food that they loved and that they missed, and eventually came to New York, where I was born. But you have to make that decision. I have friends who, during the last administration, bought homes in Portugal. They're not living there now, but There may be a day when they seem smarter than us.
May
Right?
I add something?
Yeah.
One of the reasons many people didn't leave, including my family, because they couldn't accept the fact that everybody was killed. And so every few weeks they were a list of people came back who they found. They were in different concentration camps, different war camps all over. And everybody kept on running and checking if their family was there and somebody would come back. By the time everybody realized that most people will not come back, it was too late.
And again, keep in mind, there was not the kind of instant knowledge we have now, not even about what had occurred. And the way of communication and the lines of communication to get that information, the Red Cross had lists, but it could take 1.5 years to hear back from them.
Exactly.
And it also wasn't that easy. There was a film called Jealous of the Birds that was focused on Jewish people who didn't leave Germany after the war. And they also, a lot of them had one sick beside waiting for family members to return, if someone were sick or, disabled in some way, they either couldn't travel or they weren't admitted to other countries not being healthy. So there were people who simply just
Felt they were too old to travel.
Yeah.
Or start all over in a new country.
All right. Well, I want to thank Eva. Köszönöm szépen. Was it okay? Leslie, thank you so much. All right. Good night, everybody.